welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me on a Saturday. I know it's a little crazy to devote 2 hours of your weekend to learning about Vectorworks, but I guess you're all just as nerdy as I am, so I love that. So yeah, thank you for being here. My name is Andy, if you don't know me, and I'm a set designer and art director based in Los Angeles. And I'm a member of the Art Directors Guild, which is Local 800. It's the union for design for film and television and broadcast. And I see a number of union folks here as well, so happy to see that. And today we're going to be looking at some drafting that you've seen in the emails based on a film called Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers, which is currently streaming on Disney+. It's actually pretty entertaining. I actually really ended up liking the film quite a bit, so I do recommend it. Check it out afterwards. And especially if you're a 90s kid like myself, there's a lot of nostalgic things in there. And this was back in 2020 that we filmed this. It was the first project that I got on once things started up again after COVID had shut everything down. But it did just start streaming this year. So yeah, do check it out. And once I jump into the Vectorworks screen share, what I'm going to do is first just kind of point out the geography of some of the menus and palettes and stuff that we're going to touch, just so you kind of know what our targets are. And then I'll go through the steps to create that data visualization from the beginning, so you know the whole process. And the first time that I go through it, just kind of sit back and absorb it. And after that, we'll actually repeat the steps a little slower so that you can follow along in your own Vectorworks file if you want. And I'll share with you a practice file that you can open up and already have the geometry, so we're all on the same page. But for now, just sit back, maybe record any questions that you have. And then at the short break in the middle, you could type them into the chat or just let me know what questions remain so I can address them in the second half. So I'm going to share my screen now and we'll actually jump into Vectorworks. And like I said, I'm going to first just kind of point out some of the menus and palettes that are going to be important, just so you know kind of what we're looking at. And I guess I should give a little context about the set. We kind of briefly chatted about it before we started, but this set is called Main Street USA, and it's kind of a takeoff on the Main Street area of Disneyland. So the idea was that it was really over the top Americana, colorful, bubblegum, happy, kind of vintage architecture. Although in the movie, there's actually a line about how all of these businesses are fronts for more nefarious dealings. So there's some shady business happening behind the scenes. And we were actually originally going to film at the Universal Studios backlot, which has some beautiful buildings and some great architecture. And then kind of last minute, we found out for whatever reason that we couldn't film there anymore. And we had to switch over to Allied Studios, which is up in Simi Valley. And they have kind of a backlot, which was not fantastic. There's very basic facades, lots of 2x4s, and it wasn't particularly pretty. So we had to kind of scramble to adapt our original designs from Universal to this new backlot. And also we're all working on Zoom at this point, so we don't really have in-person meetings as much. And we had to, like I said, adapt those designs, knowing that we had to keep some of the original architecture just for time and budget reasons, sometimes literally just keeping it as is, sometimes painting what's there, but also sometimes constructing new elements to kind of plant on to what's there. And then above that, all of the second stories of the facades were honestly really ugly. So we knew we were going to be replacing them with VFX afterwards. So that's what we're seeing in this bottom elevation here. All of the green areas were added after the fact digitally by the VFX department. So with all of these different conversations happening on the fly, kind of as we're developing this design, I knew that I wanted to record this on paper in a color-coded elevation so that everyone was on the same page, and that once we made a decision about something, it was recorded and we knew what it wanted to be. So right off the bat, I knew that I also didn't want to just make my model be green and purple and blue, because that doesn't work so well, because we want to actually see the paint colors and the brick and so forth when we're designing. So I needed to find a way to literally click a button and have it recolor itself based on those different departments. And that's where data visualization really came to the rescue. I think this is the first time I used it like on a production, but I've used it a bit more since then, and it can really be adapted to a lot of different contexts. But today we're just going to examine exactly how this was done. Now, the other important thing to know is that both this top view and this bottom view are coming from the same geometry. I didn't want to duplicate all of the geometry just to have one that's the real color and one that's color-coded, because then as things change, you have to change it in 2 spots, and that's just an absolute headache. So what we're looking at here, these are 2 different viewports on a sheet layer. Sheet layers, of course, are where we print from, and the geometry is back in the design layer. These are both looking at the same design layer. The top one is showing what the actual design layer looks like with textures and fill colors and paint colors. And the bottom view has data visualization enabled. And that's literally the only difference. Where this is done for a viewport is over in the object info palette. So that's kind of our properties palette for whatever's selected. This bottom viewport that I have, data visualization, is color code by department. This is something I made that I've applied to this viewport. Whereas the top viewport here, data visualization is none. So that's literally the only difference. Now, what we're learning today is going to be how to set that all up. So data visualization can be applied to a viewport, but it can also be enabled when you're in the design layer looking at your actual geometry. So let me just show you that quick. So I'm just going to use a saved view here to go to my design layer. This is the geometry that viewport, both of those viewports we're looking at. Right now we're seeing the true color, so the textures and the solid fill colors for some of it. And if I wanted to see that color coding effect here, that data visualization is enabled up here in the upper right. There's these little glasses that have 2 different filter colors, almost like 3D glasses. Because when you enable this, it's kind of like seeing the world through a certain lens or through a certain filter. So up here, when I click that, I get the same options that was in the object info palette for viewports. So I can color code by department, and it'll take a moment to, oh, and Vectorworks crashed. Well, we're off to a great start, folks. Let me just reopen Vectorworks. Probably doesn't like me screen sharing and recording and being in Vectorworks at the same time. But here, actually, we can see in the background, I still have this little slideshow running. Each of the plates also have these little viewports that I have the true color on one side and the data visualization on the other. So the great thing about this data visualization is that you set it up once, and then it can be applied to a lot of different places. So it's not like I'm going to each individual viewport and doing like class overrides or something like that, because that's just a pain in the butt. This is literally one central source where I choose that recoloring. And then, of course, on each of the plates that do have that little color coding effect, I've put on a little key that shows exactly what that color coding is. So there's a legend so that everyone was on the same page. So location, paint, construction, there were awnings that we were just replacing the fabric on, graphics, and digital extension. So that's an important thing too, is make sure you have a key so that people know what the colors actually mean. All right, so let's go back to the design layer and see if it's a little happier this time, hopefully. I'm going up here to that eyeglasses menu, and I'm going to turn on color code by department. There we go. And now I'm seeing the color coding in real time, live for my geometry. For the moment, I'm also going to turn on edges just so we can see a little better. And this is actually reacting in real time to data. Now, what we haven't covered is kind of what that data is, but essentially each of these pieces of geometry, I've told them which department they are. Now, here's the tricky thing. Vectorworks doesn't inherently have a dropdown for department. I can't select, an extrude and say, oh, this is VFX or graphics. So what we have to do is create custom data to be able to do that. And this is done in the data tab. So the data tab is the middle tab at the top of the object info palette. A lot of us have probably never interacted with it. I don't use it a whole lot outside of this context. I know some lighting designers and maybe architects use it more often, but this is probably new to a lot of folks. So in this data tab, when I select objects, I have this dropdown that I've made, which is source, or I might call it department. And this is where I'm choosing what each object is. So if I selected this, which is currently graphics, which I color coded as yellow, and I changed it to, new construction, it changes the filter color as well. So that data viz is interactively applying every time I change something. So this is done with a record format. Now, a record format is also a new thing to a lot of folks, and it's actually a separate thing from data viz. So you're actually going to learn 2 new things today, data viz and record formats. Record formats are resources, so they're going to be found in the resource manager, which is kind of like the collection of assets that live within a file. Resources include textures and hatches and symbols and all sorts of stuff. And that's found under Window, Palettes, Resource Manager. It's also Command R or Control R to pull it up. And here I should be able to find somewhere here, record format for DataViz. That's the name I gave it. Record formats always have this little card icon. It's kind of like a Rolodex informational card. And that phrase record format, essentially that just means a collection of information, a collection of fields really. Each record format, you can define multiple fields to exist in it. I only have one field for source or department, but it could have multiple. If I select this and right click and choose edit, you can see that field here that I've defined along with those values. And that's actually where we're going to start today as far as going through the process. We're going to start with the record format, creating that. Then we'll attach it to the geometry. We'll set up the DataViz, and then we'll recolor our viewport. So that's kind of the overview of all the different areas that we'll be touching today. And in order to keep this kind of as simple as possible, I'm actually going to work in a separate file that just has this one facade here, because this file has a lot of extra stuff. The set was actually way more complicated than I really want to get into, because in real life, the buildings were spaced out further than we wanted them to be in the movie, because these are little chipmunk characters. So we were digitally moving things around and like taking one facade from over here, moving it over there, and it just was very complex. So I don't really want to work in this file at the moment for this class. I'm going to work in this other file. And before I do that, just a quick overview of the process now that we're really getting into data visualization. There's 3 steps that I like to really boil it down to. The first one, have geometry. That's a pretty simple one. It's best to really have something to work with when you're doing this data viz process. You don't really want to start with a data viz because then it's hard to see what's happening. So I'm going to give you geometry partway through the class to work on. Step 2, make that data. That's where the record format is going to come in. But also note that data visualizations could be created based on data that just already exists in the model. Like you could color code by the classes that you've assigned to them, or the layers that objects are on, or the surface area or square footage of things. You can color code based on all sorts of data. But today, since that department isn't a field that exists, that's why we're using the record format resource. And then the third step is to create that data visualization and then enable or disable it for the design layer or viewport. So those are our steps. Here is that geometry that we're going to work on. All right, so this file, I've stripped out all the classes. I've put everything on the none class, again, just to keep it simple, but you could have things on other classes. I've also deleted that record format so that we can recreate it from scratch. So this really is just a clean file. So step 1, I have geometry. That's done. We're already on step 2. I'm going to go to my resource manager. Again, I just hit Command R to pull it up. And I want to create a new resource, a new record format in this case. So I'm going to go down here to the lower left where it says New Resource. Click that button. You'll get a pop-up. These are all different sorts of resources that you can create from scratch here. And then we're going to find record format right here. When you do that, it takes you right to this window, which we saw briefly before. And this is where you need to give the record format a name and to define your field or fields that you want it to have. So I'm just going to call it record format for DataViz, just so I'm really clear about what this record format is for. But you can name it literally whatever you want. And then I'm going to hit the new button to create a new field. This field, I'm going to call it department, I think is better than source. It just makes more sense. So whenever I go to the data tab, that name is what the dropdown is. So department, and then I can define this field as 5 different types of fields. In this case, we want to do pop-up. And the second that it shows pop-up, it actually gives me this separate window where I have to define the options in that pop-up. So you're literally just typing them in. And actually at the bottom here, it says, enter a list of choices for this parameter. Separate each choice by pressing the enter or return key. So I'm going to type those in. I think it was location. And by the way, when I say location in this case, obviously the whole street is the location, but I'm meaning that we're actually seeing in the end what was originally there on location. We're not painting it, we're not doing anything. So that's location as is. Paint only, that's literally just painting what's already there. We're not building something new. New construction is for our folks in the construction department to build and kind of plant onto the facades. And then I have graphics. Our awesome graphic designer, Steve Salmonen, created tons of custom graphics for all of these storefronts. A lot of them were direct printed onto substrates by our graphics vendor. So in that case, we were getting a printed sign from graphics essentially in construction or set deck or wherever, just had to plant it on or hang it. And it's different than construction getting the materials to have to do it. So graphics was really its own separate thing. Set deck for any dressing. Greens, which isn't going to come into play today, but I'm including it because a lot of our sets do have greens. And for those of you who aren't in film or TV, that just means essentially like plants. So shrubs, trees. It also includes things like dirt and mulch. We did have greens in this set. It's just not in the example that I'm doing today. And then VFX for those digital extensions for those second stories. And then I typically just include an other field as a catch-all for anything else that might randomly come up because you never know. And again, after each of these, I'm just hitting enter to go to the next line. Then I can hit OK, OK, OK. Lots of nested pop-ups because Vectorworks likes to do that. And now I have in my resource manager a record format. Yay! And I see that that card icon, so I know it's there. It's in this file. What I'm going to do, I'm going to hit Command S because it's always a good practice to save as you work because you never know when Vectorworks is going to randomly crash on you. Although actually, it's in recent years, it very rarely crashes. It tends to only do it when someone's watching. Okay, so I have that record format in this document, but it's not attached to anything. So none of this geometry knows that that record format exists. Like it's completely unaware of that record format. So what we have to do is we actually have to attach that record to the geometry. It's kind of like taking a Post-it note and walking up and sticking it onto the geometry. And I can do that kind of all at once. I'm going to select all and attach it, although you can also do it individually. And as you add new objects later on, you'll have to attach that data as you go. So I'll hit Command A or Control A to select all. And then over here in the Object Info palette, I'm in that Data tab, that Center tab. And there's a button right here called Attach Record. When you click that, you get a little pop-up. This is really just showing you the record formats in your document. This is a resource selector. And you should see the one that you created, although if you don't, it could be that you're in some other file. So on the left, make sure your open file is selected. And then you can just double click it to apply it. So now everything has that record format attached to it, and I can see it up here in the list of record formats for that object. Now, for industries that use a lot of data, there might be multiple record formats attached to an object, and you can select the record format up here to then see the fields that are in that format. Remember, the word format just kind of means a collection of fields. So when I select that format at the top, at the bottom, I get that pop-up that I created called Department, and I can choose any option here. Now, it's not going to recolor the model because that's the job of data visualization, which I've not set up yet. We're just doing the data part. And record formats have existed for a long time. Data visualization came out, I believe, in 2020. So they're actually two separate things, but they work together in this case. So what I can start doing for now is just to select a couple objects that I know are different departments and assigning them to those departments. So for example, I know that this bread basket bakery sign is graphics, so I'll switch it to that. Along with these two menu signs, I guess I could do those as well. The awning I'll select and say, I'm just going to call that set deck because they're the ones replacing the fabric. I know these pilasters, these orange vertical things, I know those are new construction, so I'll select those. Oh, they're already on new construction. I guess I started out with everything on new construction, which is fine. As I start going, it's already getting hard to keep track of what data might be attached to what. And in the past, you'd actually just have to click through and kind of see what the data is, or you could use worksheets. You can extract this data to worksheets. But the beautiful thing about data viz is that it's visual and interactive. I'm a very visual person. I want to see the data that I've attached. So let's go ahead and get that set up, and then we'll come back and continue attaching data appropriately. So the data viz menu, when we're in the design layer, remember, is up here in the upper right. And this little pop-up that we see has a list of data visualizations in the bottom. The default is to have no data visualization, which is this none option here. Then there's the list of data vizes in the current document, which there aren't any. Then there's the user folder. There's also not any there. And then there's some default data vizes that exist in the Vectorworks libraries. They're not very useful, but they do exist. So there's kind of 4 categories here. We're going to create a new data viz, and then it's going to show up in this current document category. To create a new one, it's up here at the top, new data visualization. And we get this window. This is where all the magic kind of happens behind the scenes. It's where you're essentially telling each department to be a particular color. Now, this window also has a lot going on. Let me first just break it down kind of visually. There's really 3 parts to this window. The first part is just to give the data visualization a name. So in that drop-down list, it's just the name of the data viz. The second part, which is here, object criteria, that is determining which objects this data viz applies to. Because you can actually tell it to only apply to certain categories of objects, whether it be a certain layer or a certain object type or whatever. You can filter it down. Now today, we're actually just going to apply this data viz universally across the board. So we're not really going to get into this unless we have time at the end. I can come back to it, but we're just going to leave this at the default. So that leaves us with this bottom part here, the display criteria. What this is doing, it's telling us how those objects should be recolored. So name, which objects, and then how to recolor them. So we're really going to focus on this bottom part today. Let's call this recolor by department. And again, we're just going to leave the object criteria as is. And then we're asked how to recolor them. Well, I want to recolor based on that record format. So in this dropdown, there's different ways you can recolor things. You could just recolor literally everything to be the same color. You could use a parameter, a record, IFC entity, which is more of an architecture thing, or function. Well, record sounds like what we want because we made a record format. I'll choose that. Now, since there's only one record format in the document, it just already chose it. But if you had multiple record formats, this is where you choose which one you want to use. And then here you choose which field. Now, again, there's only one field in my record format, so it's just already there. It's department. So record format for data viz, department. Now down here, we start to see some of those categories. You're probably wondering, why are there only 3? Because you made a lot more categories than that. Well, that's because data viz only applies to data that exists in the document. So I have not yet used those other categories, so they're not showing up here. That might seem a little annoying in this context, but there's a reason behind it because, like I said before, there's a lot of different ways that you could recolor things, and some of those ways would have a ton of values, and you don't want to see things that aren't applicable to your file. So it really narrows it down to what exists in your document. So in this case, I've already used graphics, new construction, and setdeck. We're going to come back here to choose the colors in a moment, but I just want to get those other categories here first so that I have all of them. So graphics, new construction, setdeck. It looks like I need VFX. So I'm going to choose this whole upper story here, which is a group, so it's just one big container. I'm going to do VFX for that. I already forgot what categories I have and don't have. So I'm going to come in here. Once you already have a data viz, you just hit edit data visualization to come back to it. Okay, graphics, new construction, setdeck, VFX. I'm missing location as is. I know the door was location, like we didn't do anything to it. Okay, in the end, I know I was using 5 categories. I didn't use other or greens, so we're good to go. So what I was doing, I was going back to the model and attaching that record format to objects just to make sure I had at least one example of each category. So now we can set up those colors. So this bottom window here, one thing that's not entirely clear the first time you look at it is each of these lines is really just showing a little kind of summary of the graphic attributes for that line. But really, each of these lines has a bigger window that determines all of those. And what you do is you select the line that you want to edit and hit edit, and it pulls up this window, which we're going to look at. You can also just double click the line, which is kind of faster. You can also select multiple values and edit them all at once. And in this case, it literally applies the changes across the board. So let me just do one of them as an example. If I want my graphics to be something other than their original color, I'm going to edit this, and I'm going to say I want the fill color to be a solid yellow. I think I did. There. The colors are up to you. There's no standard here. And here's a really important part that's easy to miss. You have to hit this little checkbox up here that says apply attributes. I kind of wish it did it automatically as soon as you chose something, but it doesn't. And then you hit OK. There's also a check mark here that you can turn on and off. Now, the reason this exists is that you could choose to only recolor certain categories and leave the other ones as is. But let's just see if this worked. So this graphics should apply as soon as I hit OK. And it did. So this, and this have turned yellow because that data viz is telling them to use those attributes. So now that I know that this is working, I'm going to hit Command S and then come back in and finish setting up the rest of the colors. So that was graphics. Location, I think I did as a gray. And I'm just doing solid fill. It's kind of easier than dealing with this two color thing, which is really for patterns. So I'm going to do solid, and here I'll do gray. And let me just also point out that there's kind of 4 categories here. There's the fill section, the pen section, which you can also override. And actually, it's overriding everything to be a line weight of 2, which is it's defaulting to. I'm just going to go with it for now. I'm not going to worry about the pen at the moment. And here's another important thing that's happening. This data viz is actually telling the objects to have no texture. It's taking the texture away from the objects so that we can see the underlying fill color. If we said retain original texture, we would still see the brick and we wouldn't actually see the fill color from this filter. So it defaults to none, and that's important because, again, it's taking away that texture. Then the 4th category here is drop shadows. That's just for 2D plan graphics. We're not going to really touch this today. So we're really just touching the fill category. So location is gray. I'm going to do new construction as blue. I'll do set deck as, I think I did kind of an, oops, and the orangey pink color, maybe it was this one. And then VFX I do as green because it reminds me of a green screen, and it seems to make sense for most people. And there we go. Now I could have actually saved a little bit of time by starting off by selecting all of them and going into edit and just clicking apply and choosing solid across the board, and then coming back and choosing individual colors. So I just did it the slow way for now. I'm going to hit OK, and now I can see that the whole model is being recolored because all of these objects have that record format attached to them. Now, if you have objects that don't have that record format, they're just going to display as they would otherwise. Technically, the data viz is applying to all of the objects because we told the data viz all objects, where that's the default. But nothing's going to happen because they don't have that record format. So now that it's working, I can go in and start selecting objects that I know are supposed to be different departments. So this whole entryway, actually, I think we painted that. I'm going to do paint only. Oh, did I not do paint only as a data viz category? Oh, it's not checked. Oh, it wasn't there. So I guess I have 6 categories. I thought there was only 5. Paint only was purple. Notice that as soon as I attach that in there, it just appears in this data viz. So you can come back and fix things on the fly. You don't have to get it perfect the first time. All right, so there's our purple color. This glass here, we didn't do anything with the glass. That's just location as is. And I think this whole upper header thing and these side things were there, along with this window. We did paint all the trim, so I'm going to say paint. Now I'm going to come back later and talk about this particular case with this group here and how groups and symbols work, because there's some caveats there, but we're just going to ignore the fact that right now I'm painting the glass. That's fine. And when you do this, don't worry about matching exactly what we did on the show. It really doesn't matter. You just want to make sure you can get the different colors for the different departments. So this is looking pretty good. At any point, actually, the handles were already there, I think. We did not replace them. Okay. At any point, you can come up here and see your original colors, your textures and your paint colors by going to none, and then it just disables that data viz. So at any point, you can turn it on or off. Again, I'm going to hit Command S to save this just in case. And the last thing we want to do is to set up a viewport so that we can see this in elevation form. If you created a viewport when data viz is enabled, like right now, that viewport will also just have it enabled by default because the viewport is created based on what you're already seeing. But what I want to do at the moment is to create a viewport kind of the regular way with the real color, and then we'll duplicate it and recolor the second one. So we have a side-by-side of the true colors and the color-coded version on the same page. So I'm going to go, right now I'm in perspective, I'm going to switch to orthogonal because for drafting views, you want no perspective. And I'm going to go to a front view. So this is our front elevation for this facade. To create a viewport, I'm going to go up here to the view menu, and I'm going to choose create viewport. There's already a sheet layer that's blank in this file. So I'm just going to hit OK. And it puts this viewport on this sheet. If I zoom out, you can see the sheet border here in gray. I think it's a 24 by 36. And here's our viewport. It is currently out of date. So I'm going to go back to the Shape tab, and you'll see that there's a red Update button. All render styles outside of wireframe, and also when you're in top plan, any other render style has to be updated manually anytime something changes. So here I'm going to hit Update, and we should see our true colors in a moment. There we go. Then I'm going to duplicate this viewport. I'm just holding down Option and dragging, and I think on Windows it's Alt. So I have a copy of that viewport, or you could also copy and paste if you wanted to. And for this viewport, we simply come over here to the data visualization, drop down and choose Recolor by Department. And notice it didn't do it automatically because this is a viewport that have to be rendered. There's reasoning behind that, even if it seems a little annoying. You hit Update, and there we go. I now have a color-coded view of that same geometry. It also will pop in by default a little key for you in the annotations. So annotations are like the markup for a viewport. You can double click the viewport or right click and go to Edit Annotations. And in here, that's where the drawing label gets put, and you can add dimensions and all of that. It automatically put this object called a data visualization legend. I'm going to make it black. You could use this auto-generated thing as your key, because the great thing is it's always going to automatically match your data viz. So if you change colors or something, it'll update here too, which is it's really useful. I chose in my drafting to make my own just because I wanted it to look a certain way. And then I made it a symbol so that I could put it on multiple sheets, and if I changed it, it would just update all of them. But there's no reason not to just use this. There's a lot of customization here that I'm not going to get into. But also, if you don't want it, you can literally just delete that object, and now it's gone, and it doesn't matter. So that was the process from start to finish, kind of quickly. And I will review all of those steps because I know I flew through some of them intentionally, and I'll go into more detail in the second half. But what I'd love you to do is if there's specific things that didn't really make sense or that you want me to focus on, please type them in the chat so I make sure I hit those points. And in this second part, when we get to it, you can work along in your own Vectorworks file if you want, especially if you have two monitors, you can watch on one and work on the other. We're going to take a short break, but during this time, I want to give you a couple minutes to download these files. I'm going to copy and paste this link into the chat. And when you go there, if you are a Dropbox user, it looks like this. You can just click the three dots on the file and hit download. If you don't have Dropbox, it looks different for some reason. You can click whichever version you're using, 2020, 2021, 2022, or 2023. When you click that, it'll kind of go into that folder and then hit download after that. You don't need to download all four of them. So I'm going to leave this up. Again, this URL is in the chat. You don't have to like type it in manually. So go to the chat window. It's part of Zoom. You should see that link. And then download the file to your hard drive. You might have to unzip it and go ahead and open it up in Vectorworks. So we'll take a short 5-minute break. We'll be back at 10:45. Download the files, use the restroom, grab a cup of coffee, stand up and stretch, type any questions, all of the above. And yeah, I'll see you in 5 minutes. Thank you all. All right. Hopefully you all had a chance to download the files, but let me know if something's not working. Also, during that little break, I finally took a moment to look through the list of participants, and there's so many names that I recognize of people that I love and miss. Libby Stadstead, I've not seen you in like 12 years. I miss you so much. Hello, that is crazy. And also a lot of names that I don't recognize, so I'm really excited for that as well. I'm just happy you all could join me today. Any issues downloading the files? Because we're going to jump in a minute and go through the steps again from the beginning a little slower so that you can follow along. A number of you did ask some questions, a few of them in direct messages straight to me, a lot of really good questions. Some of those things I'll be covering in this next part, and some of them I didn't think of, and they're great questions. By the way, in the download, there is one called Geometry Only. That's the one you want to use. It doesn't have the data viz set up, so it's useful to practice this process. But I've also included a file called data viz finished so that you could open that up if you're having problems and see how that one was set up. There's also images of the sheet just for context, along with sheet 3, which was the other side of the street, but same idea there. So I'm going to open up my geometry only file. And I'm going to save a copy so that I don't mess up this one. Okay, so this is what you all should see when you open up that file. Again, this is only going to work in 2020 or later. We learned earlier that the 3 steps for data viz are to have geometry, to create and attach the data, and then to create the data viz. You've already completed step 1 by opening the file because the geometry is there. And then step 2 is to create that data. The record format is, it doesn't exist in the file. We have to create it from scratch. And then I'm going to show you in a bit more detail some things about how this is happening. I'm going to talk about groups and symbols and how you can have multiple levels there. Okay, so let's create that record format. You want to find your resource manager. It used to be called the resource browser in older versions. And you can find that by going to Window, Palettes, Resource Manager. There should be a check mark when it's enabled. If you don't see it, but there's a check mark, it might be like off the screen somewhere if you have 2 monitors. So just hunt for that. And in this palette, there's really 3 panes. The left pane is where you can select different files. So if some other file is selected, you're not going to see your current file. So this is really why it's a resource manager, because you can actually move resources between different files really easily and import and export them. And you can create favorites and libraries and all sorts of stuff. But just to make sure that the bold file on the left at the top under Open Files, make sure that's selected so that you see your current document. So the left-hand pane is the file. The middle pane is what's in that file. And the right-hand pane is like a preview, which is more applicable to like textures and stuff like that. Let's create that record format by going down to the bottom left and hitting New Resource. Choose record format from the list and then hit Create. I also want to point out, because I know some people prefer it, you can also right-click in the Resource Manager. There's a contextual menu for the same thing. You can also double click in a blank spot. So there's multiple ways to get that new record format. So choose that and you'll get this pop-up. First thing you want to do is give your record format a name. Again, this can be up to you. Oops, record format for DataViz is what I'm calling it today. I might change my mind tomorrow. Although actually I should say, once you've set this all up with your DataViz, it's actually not good to rename your record format because your DataViz is looking for this specific name. So don't change your mind later on, I guess. And then we want to create a field by hitting the new button right here. You get this edit field pop-up. And that's where we want to give our field a name. Let's call it department. And then, so the name, again, is the thing that appears next to the dropdown. And then we have to define the values that appear in that dropdown. Now, I said before, there's kind of 5 different types of fields. We're going to choose pop-up, but just so you know what the other ones do. Integers are kind of like whole number values, which is similar to numbers, but numbers can have decimals and other things that I'm not entirely sure about the difference. I'm sure Pat Stanford could answer that, but I'm not going to get into that. Boolean is true or false. So you could have a dropdown that just has true or false. Text is any sort of string that you could name things or type in like manufacturer or any sort of custom text that you want to be able to type in for specific objects. But the one we're going to choose is pop-up so that there's just a predefined list of choices. So here in this edit choices window is where you type those different choices. Now, if you want to match mine, you totally can, or you could actually try something different if you really want to. I did location as is, paint only, new construction. Make sure you hit enter at the end of each line or return. Graphics, set deck, VFX, which is visual effects, and other. So I'll leave this up for a moment so you can finish typing up your list of options. You can definitely come back later and add new, new categories here to this list. Although, again, I wouldn't recommend changing the names of ones that you've already set up for DataViz because it might lose that connection. Although if you really needed to change it, you could change it, and then you have to go back to your DataViz and make sure it's connecting to the new name. But once you have that list of options, you could also include greens. Again, we're not doing that today, but greens would be another category for the film and TV world. I'll hit OK, and then OK, and then OK. So now we have that record format in our file. Again, that icon always will be that card. Once you've set that up, you don't need the resource manager anymore in this process. So you could either close it out or just minimize it with the plus or minus. On Windows, there's a little pin icon, unless that's changed. I'm going to hit Command R just to disable it. And then the next step is going to be to attach all of that data to the objects in the file. So make sure you find your object info palette. It's typically on the right-hand side. If you don't have that palette somewhere, it can be enabled by going up to Window, Palettes. Where is it? It's the first one, Object Info Palette, which has 3 kind of sub-palettes or 3 panes: Shape, Data, and Render. In recent versions of Vectorworks, you can also like pull off different tabs and rearrange them. So there is more customization. So if your Vectorworks looks different, that's fine. And some of you have probably noticed that my Vectorworks looks very different because I have hidden all of my tool palettes, because I either use keyboard shortcuts, or here's a little hot tip for the day. If you hit F, you can find any command or tool quickly by just typing it in. For example, if I wanted to do like the deform tool, like I actually don't remember the hotkey for that, I can hit F and then type deform and it just pops up. This is a tangent. I'm just explaining why I've hidden all of my tool sets, because I wanted that real estate for other palettes. The point being, your screen may look different. Okay, so we found our object info palette. We found the data tab. At the top, there is the list of record formats. Well, nothing is selected right now, so it's showing me the record formats. But what we want to do is to select all the geometry, which you can do with Command A or Control A. And then over here at the bottom or in the middle, there's a button called Attach Record. That's where we associate the record format with the geometry. So you hit that button, you should get a pop-up, and we can select that record format for DataViz. You can either double click or select it and then hit the select button at the bottom. I think I pulled mine accidentally from the other file. You can actually pull in record formats from other files here. There we go. And then I might choose, while I have everything selected, you probably just want to choose the department that is used kind of most in the file. So I'm going to choose as my default right now, paint only, and then I'll come in and we'll change individual things. Now, one thing I want to point out, because this happens sometimes in certain copies of Vectorworks for some reason, is that this center divider, which is something you can click on where there's a little circle, sometimes it's just all the way at the bottom. And this actually one user had it this way, and they couldn't see the dropdown. If that ever happens, you just want to find that little dot and pull it up. I'm not really sure why it defaults to that for some users. So again, if you don't see that dropdown, you want to expand the bottom part of your data tab. And then you should see your dropdown that you made. Okay, so I chose paint only as my kind of starting point. And then I'm going to click off into the blank space to deselect everything. Now I can go in and start choosing individual objects to assign them to particular departments. I might start with an easy one, which is this group at the top. It's the digital extension. And I'm going to choose the category of VFX. Now I might choose the graphics, which, by the way, in this file that I've shared, I have removed the detail of the graphics just because I didn't feel comfortable sharing someone else's work in that way. But these objects are the graphics department. I might select the awning and choose set deck. And again, I might start with those columns, or sorry, the pilasters, because they are easily identifiable, and those were new construction. The category that I haven't used yet, I think, is location as is. Remember the first time we did it, those categories don't show up in the DataViz until they've been used somewhere. So I'm just trying to get at least one example of each category. So the door, I know, is location as is. And again, yours doesn't have to exactly match mine. Once you've done that, actually, I'll just give you a moment to continue attaching a couple things. If anyone is having issues with that, let me know right now and we can figure out what's happening. Victoria asks a good question. Can you add to this list essentially can you revise the list to add a field? And you definitely can. In this case right now, if you happen to maybe like forget one of those categories and you wanted to add it in, or maybe just down the road, you discover some other category that you want, all you have to do is to go back to your resource manager, find that record format that you're using, you right click and choose edit. From there, you'll see your list of fields, or field in this case, and you can choose it and hit edit again. And then to get back to that pop-up list of options for the pop-up, that's this define button over here, which I didn't really point out before. But if you do want to come back and edit the list for the pop-up, you hit this define button, and then you can change that there. I'm going to make a category of Victoria. And now it shows up in the list. Okay, cool. So we have attached at least one instance of each department to different objects. From there, we can start setting up our data visualization. Find up in the upper right-hand corner the eyeglasses. Now, I should point out that the eyeglass icon was actually new, I think, in 2022. And before that, in 2021 and 2020, the icon was like 4 colored squares. That was the data visualization when it first came out. So if yours looks a little different, that's fine. You can hover over it to make sure it's data visualization, but it's going to be in the same spot right here. I was happy when they changed this icon because it really illustrates what's happening. Again, you're seeing the world through a particular lens. When you choose this dropdown, we're going to do new data visualization because we're making one from scratch. And we'll give it a name. What did I call it? Recolor by department or color? I think I did color code by department. Again, doesn't really matter. So that was the first part, was a name. The second part is criteria. We're just going to leave it to be all objects. But if you were doing some other thing, you could hit define criteria and then filter down to some particular criteria. For example, you could say only recolor things that are extrudes. I don't know why you'd want to do that particularly, but that's an example of something you can do. And you could add all sorts of criteria, including like and or criteria. It can get very complex if you want it to. I'm going to hit cancel. We're not going to touch that anymore today. What we want to focus on again is this display criteria, which is this entire bottom part. This colors dropdown, what it's really saying is, how do you want to determine the colors that this data visualization imposes upon the model? We want to choose the colors based on a record. So from this first dropdown here, do objects using record. Just as a preview of what the other things are, parameters are essentially like specific object types have parameters. So you could somehow color the model based on the parameters of particular object types. Records is what we're doing. IFC entity is more of an architecture thing I'm not going to get into. In architecture, engineering, construction, all of that. And then the bottom one, objects using function, is actually something that you might want to play around with in the future, because this is where you can get more like general data, such as like the class it's on, or the layer, or the area. This also works, by the way, this whole process works on 2D objects as well. So you could have a ground plan of a new office building with a bunch of space objects, or even just rectangles showing different rooms. And you could actually color code by area, and then it'll give you a list of values. You can actually do it by range. So you could say like 0 to 100 square feet is this color, and 100 square feet to 200 square feet is this color. And you could see one of those kind of heat maps of square footage. But yeah, this function option is where you get to kind of more generic data. But again, we're going to do record. So objects using record, it chose that single record format that we have, which has a single field. And then you should see your 6 values. If one is missing, now is a good time to hit OK, and then to put something on that category, and then go back to your data viz. Because that data viz is checked, because when we made it, it also applies it, we can just hit edit data visualization to come back to it. If there's a pop-up that says changing the data source will discard the current attribute overrides, do you want to proceed? The answer is probably yes. I'm not sure exactly the context of where you were seeing that, but what it's probably doing is it's making sure that you want to change this data viz in case you had set something up before. It's just letting you know that you are, changing it. It's kind of just questioning that you really know that you want to be doing what you're doing. And in this case, we do want to change those. Sam says, yes, he clicked it and it works. So good. Is there an option that says like, don't ever ask me again? Because if so, I probably clicked that, which is why I'm not seeing that. And I would recommend probably checking that box. There's actually only one pop-up in all of Vectorworks where I don't ever choose that box to never remind me again. All of the other ones, I'm like, just stop popping up all the time. Okay, so We have chosen a record format. We see our list. And the next step is to choose those colors that we want to use for the color coding. By default, it's always going to put a pen color of black, solid, and a thickness of 2. There are many cases where you might not want that. It actually works pretty well for these elevations, but I just want to point out that if you were really doing something more custom, you may want to come in here, select all of your values, and say for the pen, this is actually overriding the pen right now. There's an option called Retain Original Pen. So that's the option you want to choose when you don't want this data viz to change that attribute. So when you do that, it's going to be whatever the original pen colors were. Just like with texture, you could say retain original texture, because there might be a data viz that you want to see the textures, and instead you're changing some other thing. So each of these options has retain original attribute. But for today, we're actually going to keep that black pen and the 2. This is useful if your geometry actually had a bunch of different line weights and you do your elevation and like some of the lines are really chunky and some are really thin and you don't want to go in and have to manually fix all of those. You can use this data viz to just make them all cohesively the same line weight. Not that I'm saying everything should be the same line weight in drafting. I disagree with that. But it might be a way to quickly clean up some messy geometry, and then you could always add on some heavier line weights on top of stuff in annotations if you needed to. All right, so how do we choose those colors? Now, the first time I did it a little slowly, like one at a time, but let's save a little bit of time right now. I'm gonna choose all 6 values at once by clicking one, holding Shift, and then clicking the first one or the last one. And then you can hit the Edit button, because on all 6 of these values, we want to apply the attributes, and we want it to be a solid fill. So this is changing it for all of them, and then I can hit OK. And what you'll see is it adds that check mark in the Apply column, and it gave a fill of white just as a default, because now all we need to do is go into each category and give it a specific color. If I were to hit OK right now, it would actually just recolor everything as white. So we're going to go down the line. Remember, you can just double click the line to edit it. You don't necessarily have to come down to this edit button unless you're doing multiple at once. So I'm going to double click the graphics line and then come over here to the fill section and choose a color here. By the way, the color selector popover is new to 2023. So if it looks different in an older version, that's fine. I actually really like the new version. And if you are in 2023, the way to choose different palettes is this little drop down here. So you can see it colors in the active document, which I think the document I shared with you should have the same colors as me. But if you wanted different colors, you could choose different palettes here, like the standard Vectorworks colors, for example. Or you could even come over to the custom tab and choose whatever color you want. You can also use the eyedropper to sample colors on your screen. Right now, though, I'm just going to keep it on active document because I know it has the colors that I like. What am I on? I'm on graphics, so I'm going to choose yellow for that. I'll hit OK. Yeah, so Sam had a good point. You could use data viz to toggle between textured and white model, although there's actually a setting in your render settings just to disable textures and or disable colors. And that's kind of a built-in way to do that. But yeah, you could do things like that. You could also use data viz to apply a texture to all the objects, like a cardboard texture, like a paper texture, so it looks kind of like a model, like a physical model. This would be a way to do that. All right, so graphics yellow. I'm going to double click location as is. I like to do this one as gray because it kind of means like it's already there. You don't have to do anything. It's good to go. New construction I did as blue. I like blue. And most of the drafting is for the newly constructed things. Paint only, I did purple because paint and purple both start with P, and that's the logic that my brain uses. Set deck, I'll choose maybe, I don't know which one it was. I'm going to choose this one. And then VFX, again, I like to use green. Let me also point out that if you aren't yet at the point of wanting to choose specific colors, because by the way, these are colors that I like rendered and then test printed and kind of saw if they were too dark, and I kept on actually lightening them, which is why they're very pastel, because it worked well for the print. But you might not be ready to decide those specific colors. So there is something that you could do just to quickly get a data viz up and running with kind of arbitrary colors. And that is to just hit this auto color button. Don't do it right now if you've already selected colors. Just watch what happens on my screen. If you hit the auto color button, it will just apply a rainbow essentially to your values. Now, if you had a really long list of values, it will automatically do increments of color between essentially red and violet, I guess, or magenta. Now, in this case, I could hit OK, and I would quickly be up and running with those 5 colors. And I don't think there's an undo button to just undo that. So let me just really quick choose my colors again, and that will give everyone a moment to catch up. And then we'll move forward. Once you have those 6 colors, you can hit OK. And you should see your recolored model. When you create a new data visualization from scratch, it does automatically enable it. But remember, if you do want to go back to your original color, just come back here and switch over to none. If you want to change the colors that you're seeing, just come back up here and hit Edit Data Visualization. There's also, let me point out, there's an option called Manage Data Visualizations. And that could be a way, if you had multiple data visualizations, you can come in here and rename them. You can duplicate them. You can also then come into each one and edit them, even if they're not enabled. And you could also, once you have this set up, if it's a data viz that you will reuse in the future in other documents, you could either just save it into your template and then it's already there. But you can also export these settings and put them into your user folder. And then in the future, you can be in any document, and it will just be one of the data viz options in the list. And you can just choose it. It's already done. It'll only work if the data is also there. But yeah, there's ways to save this into your user folder. I should also point out, if we back up to that record format, because it's a resource, you could put this in a favorites file, or you could just put it in your template and save your template, and then it's already there. So if you're using data viz a lot, which you're probably not doing like a lot, but if you have a record format and a data viz that you do want to always have, just open up your template and either do it there or get those settings there, and then just save your template. And then every time you start a new file, it's just already there. Now with the resource part here in the resource manager, note you could actually just drag this icon into any file, and then it will just be in that file. So I'll give you all now a moment to continue applying data to the different objects. Let me just open up the finished one. And in a moment, I'm going to talk about this window specifically, but I'm just going to give you a moment to get everything else up to speed while I look through the chat and see what other questions I may have missed. Cool. So let's jump into those windows exactly as Tyler is pointing out in the chat. So how does this all work when you have containers? And by containers, I mean groups, which are kind of a container that have objects inside of them. Groups, symbols. What happens is that you could apply that record format to either the objects in the container, or you could apply it to the container itself. But what happens when you do both is that the container kind of overrides everything inside of it. And what I mean by that is right here, I've specifically included a group that has inside of it objects that we want 2 different colors. And if we select that group, let me go back to the one you have. If I select that group, whatever department I choose, it recolors everything inside of that group. even if I were to double click and go inside the group and choose something different for the individual child objects, I can attach that data in here, but it's not going to do anything because it's being essentially overridden by the container itself. And I'll show you how to fix that. So I'm going to choose the glass and say location as is, and then everything else was painted. But it's still showing as the color of the group. The data viz process is very literal and kind of linear. It's code that is executing in a particular fashion, and essentially it is applying that data viz first to individual objects, and then to any container that it might be in, and then whatever container that might be in. Because remember, you can have nested containers in Vectorworks, many levels deep. It's always going to apply outward like that, and those parent objects kind of take hierarchy. So in this case, one thing you could do is just ungroup it, that's fine. But maybe you want to keep this group for whatever reason. Maybe that group is on a class that you want to stay on that class, or you just want it organized in this way. All you have to do is to not have the record format on the group. So it's not going to do anything because there won't be any data to change it. So if you've already applied a record format to a group, for example, and you want to remove that, you simply select that object and then come over here and hit the detach button. Now, if you had multiple record formats, make sure you have the correct one selected. In our case, there's just one. So hit detach. It'll say, do you really want to do this? I'll say yes. And now what we have is the group isn't doing anything in the data visualization process. So the only thing we get is the result of what's inside the group. So again, what I did earlier is I went in the group and I attached the record format here. Hopefully that answers the question. The same thing is going to happen for symbols. So here, these pilasters are symbols, and the data is currently attached to the symbol itself. So anything I do inside of that symbol isn't going to apply because no matter what, it's being overridden by the container of the symbol. So if you wanted to just plant on maybe these prismatic little panel mold things, if you wanted two colors here, you would not want to have a record format on the symbol itself, and instead you'd want to go into the symbol and do it here. So I'll attach the record on the inside. Like maybe the pilaster was already there and you're just planting on this geometry, you would do that inside the symbol. And then the container isn't doing anything for this instance. Notice this one here, that symbol has the record format, so it's all blue, whereas this symbol doesn't have the record format, so it's showing the stuff on the inside. Hopefully that makes sense. Let me know if I should explain it a different way. Do you find DataViz adds a lot to the file space, or is this a rather small addition to a file? It should be pretty small because it's really just a little bit of code, a little bit of data. The things that take up a lot of file space are mainly textures, especially high resolution textures, and geometry, especially meshes that have a lot of detail to them, along with maybe images and rendered viewports if you're saving the cache into the file, which I do. Those are the things that do take up space, but DataViz and record formats are going to be negligible. Tyler says, so it kind of sounds like when you have containers like groups or symbols, you have to assign their DataViz info at the lowest individual objectist level. Yes, if you want to have different colors within that container, that is absolutely true. If the entire container is the same color, for example, at the top here, then you don't have to do that. But if I wanted some of these windows to be a different color, then I couldn't do it for the whole group because it does, again, override the contents of that group. All right, well, I'll just give you one more minute to kind of make sure everything is working, ask any other questions, and then we'll review the process of turning this into a printable elevation on a sheet layer. There's not a quick toggle key to get out of DataViz and back to textures. It would be nice if there were, at least not that I don't know of a way to do it. So you do currently have to come up here and switch there. Let's take this view and do an elevation of it so that it's on a sheet layer. Right now I'm in perspective, and if you are as well, you can change that here in this dropdown to orthogonal, which means all the lines are parallel. And then I'm going to go to a front view here. Last time when I demonstrated it, I turned that data viz off and created a viewport. But let's just skip a step and create a viewport directly from this so you can see that you don't necessarily have to do those steps if you don't want to. If you want this to just be a data viz viewport, simply go to View, Create Viewport. There should already be a blank sheet layer in the file that I shared with you. You could come here and change settings as you create this viewport, but for right now, most of the defaults are going to be fine. And then you hit OK. When you create a viewport, it always takes you to the result. So you're now on a sheet layer. You're no longer on the design layer. And you should see that viewport. It may have created a drawing title if that checkbox was checked. And it's also going to create that legend at the bottom in the annotations. To see the result, switch back over to the shape pane of the OIP and hit update. And there you have it. Now I'm actually going to talk a bit more about some render settings that I didn't cover before. Right now, this is a viewport that is just showing a shaded render, which was previously known as OpenGL. So OpenGL was renamed shaded. It's essentially the same thing. That is our render mode for this viewport, where it says background render. Per viewport, you can actually change some settings about that render mode. And that's going to be this background render settings button right here. This is going to be just for this viewport, so not globally in the file. Although it starts with the global defaults, when you make this viewport, you can now change them. And what I specifically want to look at is the fact that the edges that we're seeing right now are coming from the shaded render, and they are pixelated raster-based edges, which is why when I zoom in, they start to look kind of crappy. And if you were to print this, it wouldn't look super good. So in this case, and actually for almost all of my drafting that's coming from 3D models, I do this process where I turn off those edges and I turn on hidden line edges, which are vector-based. They're very clean and clear. You can zoom in infinitely and they will print much more nicely. So I'll show you how to do that. So background render, shaded, I want to turn off those edges. So I hit background render settings and I turn off draw edges. I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to hit update right now just to show you the result of that. This is shaded render without those edges. It just removes those black lines. And now on top of that, I want to add a hidden line render pass as a foreground render. So every viewport will have a background render and a foreground render. Background render is like the base one, and then foreground render is an optional thing on top of that. And that's where we choose hidden line. So again, hidden line, when we update, will do a pass where it's showing the vector geometry of all of those edges. And if I zoom in, they look nice and crisp and clean. There's a button in the quick press area to zoom that line thickness or not. It looks like a little magnifying glass. And that's going to print much more nicely. What's also happening in our case today is that the data viz is telling all of the objects to have a line weight of 2. And that line weight is what we're seeing in hidden line. Because hidden line is vector-based, you're actually seeing the pens of all of the objects. If we weren't talking about data viz, if this was just a regular elevation viewport, you would actually be seeing the line weights of individual objects. Whereas shaded edges, those raster edges, those are always just the same thickness across the board and they're always black. Whereas vector lines can have different thicknesses and they can also have different colors, even though typically we do all black. Okay, so now I have shaded combined with hidden and it looks much better. And this is where I might then, once I have one viewport set up, I'm doing it the opposite direction from what we did before. I'm going to turn off data viz in my duplicate. Again, to duplicate, just hold down Option or Alt as you drag, or you could copy paste if you want. In this viewport, I'm going to switch it to none. It deletes that legend automatically, and I will hit update, and there we go. So you should now be able to have two side-by-side elevations, one showing the true color and one showing the color-coded version. And depending on the context of what you're doing, maybe these aren't side-by-side, maybe they're in different sheets, maybe they're top and bottom, maybe it's a separate thing that kind of goes to the art directors to communicate. It really depends on what you're doing. And I should say in context that on this show, I was a set designer, although I'm also an art director in the union. But I did include all of this on the drafting because it was the clearest for everyone. I did have one sheet that we looked at earlier that was the entire side of the street. And then I also included on each facade drafting a little version just for that one building. But all of those color-coded viewports are using the same DataViz settings. But that actually kind of wraps up this process. I guess the final thing, just in case anyone's a little newer to Vectorworks, if you wanted to export this sheet, I like to use File, Export PDF. Although you typically might be encouraged to use Publish, but I like Export PDF because it just does the sheet you're on. You don't have to worry about selecting which sheet. So Export PDF, and then you export it, save it. And then my Acrobat Reader is opening. There it is. And then you could print this. There's also something called image effects, which is a whole separate topic that you could apply on top of all of this, especially if it's maybe a little too dark when it prints. For a viewport, you can do apply image effects and then hit this image effects button and then just turn up the exposure, or you can play with these different settings, kind of like a photographic filter at the very end, and then that can also have some effect on the final product. So like this, for example, I might choose to lighten it just a little bit, especially depending on your printer. Sometimes things print really dark. That might help you out on the fly. When do you apply a color to the facade? Do you do that with a texture color class? You could do that in any of the above ways. In this particular file, the things that are solid colors, I just did with a fill color. Although in other cases, sometimes I'll make a texture that has a subtle paint texture, like an orange peel, like a little bit of breakup, and then I will filter it or combine it with the fill color, which is something you can do. But in this case, it was quick and dirty. I literally just selected an object, and you can actually enable Benjamin Moore palettes because that's what we were using. And the production designer had a palette, had a swatch book, and I had a swatch book, and we would be like, how about this color? And I could just choose that one. The great thing about 2023 is that if you know the number or the name, you can just type it in and it starts to filter down to just that color, which was really nice. But yeah, you could do it as textures as well, and you could do things by class. I should also maybe point out that you can do, some of you might be like, oh, why didn't you do this color coding with class overrides? If you know what that is. Class overrides only work when the objects are using class attributes, which isn't always the case. So that gets really hairy really fast. And you also have to do it manually for individual viewports. The nice thing about DataViz is it kind of brute force overrides the attributes no matter what, regardless of class settings. It literally doesn't care about class settings, which is nice. But Victoria, to answer your question, I could have like a class called like trim, and I could tell that class to be orange or to use an orange texture, and I could use class textures. So I kind of mix and match depending on what I'm doing. Was there a reason you built all of the windows and doors versus using Vectorworks symbols? Absolutely, because the default door and window parametric tools in Vectorworks are great for early phase planning of a design to get proportion and size and layout, but they really are not very customizable when it comes to details, especially with trim and molding and sills and things like this. That would be pretty impossible to do with the window tool. Now, I might start off with a wall and 4 window objects if I'm designing something, just to kind of figure out the proportion and layout. But frequently I will then replace those with custom symbols. And there's actually on my website a tutorial about how to do that. So if you ever want to make your own symbols, specifically your own window and door symbols, just go to andybrumell.com, go to resources. There is a tutorial on that. But that's the only way to get this kind of really custom geometry. As far as file size, yes, it is helpful to whenever you have something that is showing up multiple times, you should make it a symbol, not only for your own sanity, because then you can just change one and they all change, but also it does reduce file size because Vectorworks is really just saving the information for one of them, and then it just has to put it in multiple places. So instead of saving 4 times the geometry, it just saves 1. So I'm, again, just reading through the chat here. Feel free to add any other questions that you may have. But yeah, I think I'm caught up on those. What I'm actually going to do at the moment is just, first of all, say thank you for joining me here today. Hopefully this was useful, and hopefully you can start to see how this might be adapted to other contexts and situations, especially because I know we have some folks here that aren't in film and TV. But this could be used to color code things by like fire rating or square footage or price or vendor. You could color code things by which vendor is providing certain things. I'm thinking in particular, Kirsten, if you're still here, World of Dance, when we had all of those different vendors providing stuff, we could have color coded using DataViz to show kind of where stuff was coming from. So again, thank you all for coming today. What I'm going to do also is pull up a final slide that if you want to, you are not obligated to, but you can say thank you by sending me a tip via Venmo or Zelle. I'm going to keep on the screen for a little bit these QR codes. Just you can scan them with your cell phone, whatever you want to do. I would appreciate it, and it will encourage me to maybe do more classes in the future. They do take some time to prep for and to pay for Zoom and to get it all happening. But I'm just happy with the turnout. So thank you all for coming. I'm also going to share again this recording with you if it works, along with the folks who couldn't make it to the session today. I'll leave this up for a moment, but I'm also happy to stay on and ask any or answer any additional questions if you have them, or if you want to, turn your camera on and just say hi or chat or show the group something that you're working on. It's just kind of free form time now. So thank you all for coming.